Imagine a man so charismatic that college students trusted him with their lives, only to vanish without a trace. This was Ted Bundy. By the age of 27, he had already claimed more victims than most criminals manage in a lifetime, slipping through police hands with a deceitful grin and an impeccable alibi. In the span of just a few years, he transformed from an ambitious psychology student, beloved by professors and admired by peers, into one of America's most infamous serial killers. What began as a series of seemingly unconnected disappearances suddenly spiraled into a nationwide manhunt, exposing the dark underbelly of small towns and college campuses alike. How did such an ordinary-looking figure become a master of manipulation and murder? Buckle up, because the story of Ted Bundy is as chilling as it is baffling. Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most notorious criminal cases in modern American history, the life and crimes of Ted Bundy. You may have heard his name whispered in true crime circles or seen his face on infamous most wanted lists. But what lies behind that unsettling reputation? Bundy's story transcends a simple list of victims. It challenges our assumptions about evil, charm, and the vulnerabilities of everyday life. Through his bold manipulations and chilling violence, he forced law enforcement agencies to rethink investigative tactics and gave rise to criminal profiling as we know it today. In the next few minutes, we'll explore why Bundy's case continues to captivate the public imagination and what it reveals about the darker corners of human nature. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to a young mother named Eleanor Louise Cowell, who, unable to care for him, handed him off to her parents, Johnny and Eleanor Cowell. For the first few years of his life, Bundy believed his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister, an early deception that would foreshadow the web of lies he later wove. The family settled in Tacoma, Washington, when he was a child, and by all outward appearances, Ted was an unassuming, polite boy who excelled in school and enjoyed activities like scouting and sports. Teachers and neighbors recall a shy youngster who often sought approval and could be coaxed into revealing very little about his private thoughts. There were whispers that he sometimes displayed odd behaviors, secretive trips to town with his grandfather and unexplained bruises, but nothing that set off alarm bells at the time. As he grew into his teenage years, Bundy cultivated a reputation for intelligence and charm. He landed a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, then transferred to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology, indulged in the bustling social life of college, and even volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline. To friends, he seemed considerate and bright, but behind that courteous facade lay an enigma, a young man obsessed with controlling how others saw him, always aware of impressions, and always hiding who he truly was. Bundy's descent into violence began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the early 1970s. In January 1974, the first confirmed abduction occurred at the Washington State University campus in Pullman. A young woman was walking across campus when a handsome man with an injured arm, wrapped in a sling, approached her, asking for help carrying books. She agreed, only to be overpowered once she was in his vehicle. Although she managed to escape and survive, her harrowing account of a bleeding, slurred Bundy fleeing into a nearby forest gave law enforcement the first inkling that a predator was on the prowl. That same frigid winter, Bundy is believed to have taken at least one other woman from the Seattle area, and by the spring, reports of disappearances began to cluster around college towns and urban parks. In each instance, his ruse was similar. He projected vulnerability, hoping to exploit the goodwill of young women who wanted to help, then demonstrated brutal efficiency once isolated. As the months wore on, a grim pattern emerged. Victims were almost always young, white women with long, dark hair parted in the middle, traits Bundy himself preferred. He stalked college campuses like the University of Washington and Washington State University, watching students for days or even weeks before striking. His modus operandi evolved too. He would feign an injury or impersonate an authority figure, asking for assistance or claiming he needed help carrying something heavy. Once trust was established, he would escort his victim to a secluded area, often behind a building or beside a wooded lot, where he would suddenly attack, binding and bludgeoning her, before disposing of the body in remote locations such as shallow graves or riverbanks. This consistency in victim profile and method began to unite previously isolated cases, leading detectives to suspect they were hunting a single, serial offender rather than copycats or unconnected criminals. By mid-1974, 2 more women had vanished from Seattle's Lake Sammamish State Park on the same afternoon, and investigators noticed striking similarities. Both had been dragged off by a man fitting Bundy's description, and in both instances, witnesses saw a Volkswagen Beetle nearby. Despite these clues, law enforcement faced jurisdictional hurdles. Cases in different counties and states weren't always shared promptly, allowing Bundy to slip through the cracks. The realization that this predator was not a local anomaly, but a roaming killer prompted the creation of composite sketches and the coordination of a multi-state task force. Yet even as police shared descriptions and car details with the public, Bundy's charm and careful planning helped him adapt, targeting new areas where he could vanish without detection. In retrospect, these early victims and the echoes of their disappearances laid bare the terrifying intelligence of a man who had transformed his knowledge of human behavior into a lethal advantage. By the summer of 1974, Bundy's boldness seemed to know no bounds. In June, at the height of the Seattle World's Fair, 18-year-old Debbie Kent vanished from an open field adjacent to a McDonald's where she and her friends had stopped for a hamburger. Witnesses later reported seeing Debbie being pushed into a Volkswagen Beetle by a man wearing a dark T-shirt. The car sped off before anyone could intervene. Just 2 months later, on August 6th, another young woman, 22-year-old Roberta Parks, disappeared from Lake Sammamish State Park after Bundy, again feigning injury by wrapping his arm in a sling, asked for help lugging groceries. Despite park visitors hearing screams and a panicked plea for aid, Bundy managed to drag Roberta behind a thicket of trees, leaving only her abandoned belongings on the picnic table. These 2 cases, separated by only a few miles, shared eerily similar descriptions of the perpetrator and his car, yet they occurred in jurisdictions hesitant to share details. By the autumn of 1974, Bundy had moved his hunting ground to Utah. On October 2nd, shortly after moving to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah, he abducted 24-year-old Carol Daw Ranch from the parking lot of the department store where she worked. Carol narrowly escaped when she managed to wriggle free from the handcuffs Bundy had secured around her wrists. Though shaken, her testimony provided the first reliable description of Bundy's face, his voice, and the distinctive metal handcuffs he carried, evidence that would haunt Bundy in subsequent months. 4 days later, Bundy struck again at the campus of Brigham Young University, luring 19-year-old Deborah Kent by claiming to need her help finding a missing briefcase. After escorting her toward his car, he throttled her and dragged her out of sight. The world would not learn of Deborah's fate until years later, when skeletal remains were discovered in a remote area of the Provo Canyon. With suspicion mounting in Utah, Bundy fled yet again, this time to Colorado. On October 23rd, in Grand Junction, he kidnapped 23-year-old Karen Campbell from an ice skating rink parking lot. Witnesses saw Bundy snatch Karen, shove her into his car, and speed away. Her roommate found Karen's body days later, partially buried in a wooded area off a dirt road near Fruita. Bundy was arrested on October 24th for an unrelated charge of aggravated kidnapping in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Despite possessing the handcuffs matching those used on his victims and a suspicious purple pin emblazoned with a gold letter, Z, later linked to Karen's hat, local authorities failed to connect him to the recent murders. Bundy represented himself briefly, posting a $1,750 bond before vanishing from public view, his freedom brief and misleading, much like his earlier ruse of a broken arm. The real turning point came in late 1974 when Bundy crossed state lines into California. In December, he is believed to have attacked several women in the San Francisco Bay Area. One of the earliest known California assaults occurred near Lake Tahoe, where a young woman survived a brutal kidnapping attempt thanks to her desperate screams. Undeterred, Bundy continued prowling neighborhoods around Berkeley and Oakland, where student witnesses described seeing a man matching his description forcing a woman into a car on 2 separate occasions. Despite flyers, sketches, and news alerts, Bundy slipped through, eluding capture as he returned to Seattle in early 1975. A lull, temporary, it turned out, followed until January 1978, when Bundy's focus shifted to Florida in a final, frenzied burst of violence. On January 15th, he bludgeoned and strangled 2 Chi Omega sorority sisters, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, at Florida State University in Tallahassee. That same night, he attacked another student, Kathy Kleiner, leaving her near death. Only days later, on January 31st, Bundy escalated even further by invading the apartment of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whom he snatched from her junior high school during lunch hour. In each of these Florida cases, the brutality was magnified. His victims were bound, bludgeoned, and left in some cases only partially clothed, signs of a killer who had grown more reckless and desperate. Echoes of the earlier ruse, a feigned leg injury offering to carry packages, were absent. By Florida, Bundy relied solely on force and surprise, no longer masking his cruelty with feigned vulnerability. Within a week, the Florida campus communities were paralyzed by terror, and law enforcement agencies across the Southeast were scrambling to piece together the evidence that would, in time, expose Bundy's nationwide reign of terror. By late 1974, local law enforcement in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and California were each grappling with chilling reports of young women disappearing under remarkably similar circumstances. Yet no single agency had fully connected the dots. In Seattle and King County, detectives first treated the abductions as isolated incidents. A missing student here, a half-naked body discovered on a riverbank there. It wasn't until survivors like Carol Da Ranch provided detailed eyewitness accounts that patterns began to emerge. Her description of a well-spoken man in his mid-20s, accompanied by distinctive metal handcuffs, gave investigators their first concrete lead. Within days, detectives in multiple jurisdictions were comparing notes, seeking commonalities in witness sketches, vehicle descriptions, and reported methods of abduction. The realization that a single offender might be responsible for crimes spanning from the Puget Sound region to the brimming college campuses of Salt Lake City and Grand Junction prompted state and local police to form an ad hoc task force. But strained communication channels meant that information often trickled slowly, allowing Bundy precious weeks to slip away between jurisdictions. At the heart of the manhunt were composite sketches constructed from survivor and witness recollections. Ruddy-haired, clean-cut, and unassuming on first glance, with penetrating blue eyes that seemed to stare straight through the lens of justice. Authorities plastered these sketches across gas stations, bus stops, and newspapers, accompanied by mug shots of known criminals for comparison. Meanwhile, forensic investigators began to piece together crucial forensic evidence: shell casings from the sites of attempted abductions, fibers matching the upholstery of a late model Volkswagen Beetle, and standardized handcuff impressions found on multiple victims. But even as official bulletins circulated, Bundy's ability to vanish into crowds and swap license plates kept him one step ahead. He exploited jurisdictional confusion by crossing state lines whenever local police intensified patrols, heading from Seattle to Salt Lake City to Denver with calculated precision, confident that detectives in one state knew little of his crimes elsewhere. Surviving victims played a pivotal role in tightening the net. After Carol Ranch's daring escape in October 1974, she collaborated with Utah authorities to refine the suspect's description, noting everything from his gait to the peculiar angle of his jaw. Similarly, a student in Seattle who barely survived a brutal attack cataloged the assailant's voice, his choice of cologne, and his skillful impersonation of an authority figure. Investigators leveraged these details to distribute increasingly accurate composites. At the same time, volunteers from neighborhood watch groups and campus safety patrols combed parking lots and dimly lit pedestrian walkways, on the lookout for anyone matching Bundy's likeness or loitering in the shadows. Local news outlets, sensing public panic, ran daily updates, even televised reenactments of Bundy's ruse, warning girls to be wary of strangers feigning injury and asking for help. By early 1975, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had formally joined the investigation. Agents specializing in offender profiling began constructing a psychological profile of the killer: educated, articulate, and likely harboring deep-seated resentment or anger toward women. Someone who would intentionally select victims resembling a past love or rejection. This insight prompted law enforcement to re-examine Bundy's past relationships, his fascination with psychology, and his uncanny ability to blend in. In Colorado, detectives dredged remote riverbanks and forested ridges for dump sites. In California, patrol cars increased surveillance around downtown Berkeley and San Francisco's Marina District. Tips from observant citizens poured in, reports of a man matching Bundy's features carrying heavy boxes, or maneuvering awkwardly as if feigning an injury. Every lead was chased, every sighting pursued, and every fingerprint compared to the national database. Although several tips turned out to be false alarms, innocent men with dark hair and sleepy expressions, investigators grew increasingly confident they were zeroing in. One critical breakthrough occurred when authorities in Salt Lake City cross-referenced vehicle registrations in late 1974 and discovered that a specific Volkswagen Beetle had changed owners multiple times under murky circumstances. The car's license plates had been swapped frequently, a classic tactic Bundy used to avoid detection. By tracing the vehicle's movements through gas station records, Investigators pinpointed its last known location near Grand Junction, Colorado, matching the timeline of Karen Campbell's abduction. Meanwhile, in Seattle, police re-interviewed park employees from Lake Sammamish State Park, consolidating witness statements that placed the same green beetle in the vicinity on the afternoons 2 women disappeared. Armed with this triangulated evidence, law enforcement increased local roadblocks, ticketing the beetle's license plates whenever they appeared, in hopes of trapping the driver. Yet Bundy's meticulous planning kept him just beyond reach. As spring turned to summer in 1975, the manhunt's urgency intensified. College towns from coast to coast circulated new descriptions of Bundy's face, noting subtle changes: slightly longer hair, a fresh shave, or a different style of clothing, while the FBI's profile emphasized his adaptability and cunning. Public service announcements urged parents to warn daughters about strangers seeking help, sparking a wave of community-led airplane patrols over forested ravines believed to be potential burial sites. In laboratories across the country, forensic analysts worked overtime, comparing tire tracks, fabric samples, and partial fingerprints against federal databases. Despite these efforts, Bundy remained an enigma, able to blend into bars, bus stations, and college lecture halls with the same unremarkable ease he used to charm his victims. Each passing day underscored the grim reality that the investigation was not merely about catching one man. It was about dismantling a meticulously orchestrated web of deception that had, to this point, eluded capture at every turn. Ted Bundy's first major brush with law enforcement came on August 16, 1975, when a Utah Highway Patrol officer pulled him over on Interstate 80 outside Salt Lake City for driving a Volkswagen Beetle with stolen license plates. The officer noted Bundy's nervous demeanor and resemblance to sketches tied to recent abductions in the Pacific Northwest. After searching the vehicle and discovering burglary tools, the officer booked him into the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where a clerk ultimately recognized him from a local news bulletin. Within days, detectives in Colorado connected Bundy to the October 1974 kidnapping of 23-year-old Karen Campbell at an ice skating rink in Grand Junction. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the distinctive handcuffs Bundy carried matched those used on Campbell, and witnesses had seen him force her into a green Volkswagen. Bundy was extradited to Colorado, charged with aggravated kidnapping, and held on $5,000 bond. While awaiting trial in Glenwood Springs, Bundy managed to post bail in early 1976 and returned to Salt Lake City, where he resumed old patterns and began planning his next move. By June 7, 1977, Bundy had grown increasingly frustrated with his confinement and seized an opportunity in the jail's law library. Over months, he had secretly loosened the screws on a light fixture grate and fashioned makeshift tools by ripping apart pages of his legal reference books. Late one evening, he pried open the window grate, removed the plexiglass insert, and slithered through a narrow opening into the maintenance corridor. Bundy then climbed down an air duct to the ground floor and slipped out through an exterior window. For 6 days, he remained at large, traveling on foot and by hitchhiking through rugged Colorado terrain until local police in Aspen, tipped off by a bartender who recognized him, arrested him for shoplifting on June 13. Bundy's brief stay in the Pitkin County Jail proved no more secure. Later that same day, during visiting hours, he donned a woman's dirty clothing, a bulky sweater, sweatpants, and blonde wig that he had stashed in a restroom, then calmly walked past guards to freedom. His disappearance from Pitkin County Jail triggered a massive manhunt across Colorado and Utah. For nearly 6 months, Bundy blended into motel rooms and bus stations under assumed names, meticulously shaving and altering his appearance to avoid detection. It wasn't until January 15, 1978, after he resurfaced in Tallahassee, Florida, that investigators finally recognized the methodical monster who had, time and again, outwitted the system. On February 15, 1978, Ted Bundy's roving spree finally came to an abrupt halt on a Pensacola street when a local police officer pulled over a Volkswagen Beetle for reckless driving. Bundy, using the alias Kenneth Missner, immediately appeared agitated as the officer discovered a suspicious range of items in the backseat, several driver's licenses bearing different names, a pair of handcuffs, and duct tape. Unable to provide a convincing explanation for these items, Bundy was arrested on suspicion of DUI and improper documentation. Though initially booked for these minor offenses, detectives noted his resemblance to the composite sketches circulating in connection with the recent murders at the Chi Omega sorority house in Gainesville, Florida. It wasn't until 2 days later, on February 17, that investigators from Broward County, Florida, who were already scouring for suspects in the Florida State University killings, received word of Bundy's arrest. As they reviewed the evidence list, the presence of handcuffs and various forged IDs immediately rang alarm bells, items nearly identical to those used in the Florida attacks. By February 18, Bundy was officially extradited to Broward County, where homicide detectives intensified their interrogation. In the impound lot, forensic technicians meticulously examined the Volkswagen Beetle and uncovered more damning evidence. Fibers matching carpet fibers found at the Chi Omega crime scene, a book of handwritten cipher pages Bundy had used to journal cryptic confessions, and fresh blood smears that, although degraded, bore similarities to the victims' blood types. Detectives pressed Bundy on inconsistencies in his story, most notably his claim to have traveled to Pensacola for a teaching conference, despite no records of his attendance. Throughout this process, Bundy remained outwardly calm, answering questions in a low, controlled voice, but his leg twitched incessantly, betraying the nervous energy he tried so hard to mask. When confronted with eyewitness testimony from an FSU student who recognized him as the man she saw dragging one of the sorority sisters, Bundy's stoic facade cracked for a brief moment, though he quickly reverted to his practiced composure. Within a week, prosecutors in Broward County formally charged Bundy with the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, as well as the attempted homicides of Kathy Kleiner and Cheryl Thomas. However, it was the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whose disappearance on January 31 had horrified the Gainesville community, that solidified the case against him. Evidence obtained from a search of Bundy's Pensacola hotel room yielded a multicolored ski mask, and several masks resembling those described by witnesses, along with handwritten maps of the Lake City area where Leach's body was later discovered. Confronted with the mounting physical evidence linking him to Kimberly's abduction, particularly strands of hair and fibers matching her clothing, Bundy's defenses began to crumble. In a desperate bid to control the narrative, he offered selective confessions to multiple murders in Washington and Utah, hoping to negotiate leniency by claiming cooperation, but prosecutors in Florida refused to relent. On February 27, 1978, Bundy was formally indicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder in Florida alone. ensuring that the charismatic drifter who had evaded capture for so long would finally face justice in the state where his brutality had reached its most depraved climax. Ted Bundy's first major trial began on June 25, 1979, in Miami-Dade County for the Chi Omega sorority house murders and Kathy Klainer's attempted murder. From the outset, Bundy insisted on representing himself, dismissing 3 appointed attorneys and retaining as his advisory counsel a lone court-appointed liaison who was forbidden from directly advising him on legal strategy. His courtroom behavior was as calculating as his crimes. He arrived wearing a dark suit and tie, projecting an air of confidence and control that unsettled both the prosecution and spectators. During jury selection, Bundy's questions to potential jurors were probing, aimed at identifying those who might sympathize with a defendant who claimed to have been wrongfully accused. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Larry Simpson, maintained a firm stance that Bundy's charisma was precisely the tool he used to charm and then murder young women. Once the trial commenced, witnesses recounted the brutal January 15, 1978, attack on Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. Deborah Jean Kent, one of the survivors Bundy had badly injured at FSU, testified via closed-circuit television with a mask concealing her face. She described how a man matching Bundy's appearance bludgeoned and strangled her friends, then partially strangled her as she faked death to escape. Her testimony, given under heavy emotional distress, was one of the most chilling moments in the proceedings. The defense cross-examined meticulously, attempting to cast doubt on her identification by emphasizing the trauma she endured, but her detailed description of Bundy's facial features and voice carried tremendous weight. Another pivotal witness was FSU student Sandra Good, who narrowly escaped Bundy's attack on January 14. She described how he pinioned her arms behind her back and struck her repeatedly, but was startled off when 2 motorists approached. Good's testimony reinforced the savage nature of Bundy's attacks and his willingness to kill without hesitation. Physical evidence presented by the prosecution included fibers found on Bowman's and Levy's bodies that matched the interior carpet of Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle, which had been seized when he was arrested in Pensacola. Blood typing tests linked blood smears inside the car to the victims. Prosecutors also introduced Bundy's handwritten death mask notes, diaries in which he cryptically referred to his crimes, sometimes alluding to campaigns that had number designations corresponding to each victim. These journals, though not direct confessions, painted a picture of a killer obsessed with recording his reign of terror in code. Bundy attempted to discredit these writings by arguing they were ambiguous and could not definitively tie him to specific murders. He also argued that the blood evidence was compromised by improper storage, but forensic experts testified that the samples had been preserved under strict chain of custody protocols, undermining Bundy's claims. Perhaps the most sensational aspect of the trial was Bundy's cross-examination of Dr. James Dobson, a clinical psychologist who testified about Bundy's personality profile. Bundy challenged Dobson's methods, accusing him of speculating beyond the evidence. When cross-examining Dr. William Cazal, a crime scene investigator, Bundy asked detailed questions about how fiber comparisons were made, insinuating that minute variations could invalidate matches. Bundy's performance on the stand was polished. He spoke confidently and at length about his travels and alibis, even volunteering details that the defense itself had not discovered, all in an attempt to bolster his image as an innocent man caught in an elaborate misunderstanding. Yet his demeanor occasionally slipped. On one occasion, he snapped when questioned about his use of multiple aliases, snarling that the prosecution was twisting harmless pseudonyms into proof of guilt. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. In early July 1979, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts: 2 counts of murder in the Chi Omega case, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of burglary with assault for an attack on Cheryl Thomas, who had also survived. Despite Bundy's efforts to appear humble and regretful in his closing statements, speaking quietly and reading from typed notes, his admission of prior thefts and deceptions only reinforced the jury's perception of him as a lifelong manipulator. On July 24, 1979, he was sentenced to death by electrocution for the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to life imprisonment for the attempted homicides. While Bundy was on death row at Florida State Prison, prosecutors in other jurisdictions prepared additional cases. In January 1980, he faced a second trial in Hillsborough County for the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whose disappearance on January 31, 1978, had haunted the Gainesville community. Bundy again insisted on self-representation, though by this time he was less coherent, lavishing long diatribes on the court and interrupting proceedings with tangential arguments about his personal philosophies. Witnesses included Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents who detailed the search of Bundy's hotel room in Lake City, where they had found the ski mask, night vision goggles, and torn pieces of Kimberly's clothing. The state's medical examiner provided testimony on Kimberly's cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and throat, countering Bundy's claim that her death was accidental. Bundy's cross-examination of Dr. Henry Lay, a forensic pathologist, was combative. He challenged Lee's estimates of time and distance when determining where Kimberly's body was dumped, but Lee's precise measurements and forensic reconstruction left little room for doubt. After a month-long trial and less than 3 hours of jury deliberation, Bundy was found guilty of Kimberly's murder on February 20, 1980. During sentencing, the gallery watched as he stared blankly ahead, rarely showing emotion, even as relatives of Kimberly, dressed in pink to honor her memory, paced the courtroom sobbing. The judge imposed a second death sentence. Bundy's attempts to file last-minute appeals hinged on complex legal arguments about his right to counsel, but higher courts repeatedly upheld the conviction, emphasizing Bundy's waiver of counsel had been both knowing and voluntary. By mid-1980, with multiple death warrants looming, Bundy's legal maneuvers dwindled. He began granting cryptic interviews in which he offered to reveal undisclosed victims in exchange for a stay of execution. But prosecutors and victims' families universally rejected these bargains. Bundy's trials became a template for how high-profile serial killer cases were prosecuted. His self-representation, while foolhardy, gave prosecutors a clear target. Every misstep he made on the stand reinforced their narrative of an arrogant, remorseless killer. The meticulous presentation of forensic evidence, particularly fiber analysis and victim-linked items, demonstrated the growing power of scientific investigation. Bundy's courtroom theatrics, including his strained attempts to humanize himself and his emotional outbursts when challenged, left an indelible mark on public consciousness. In the end, Bundy's trials underscored how a killer who once exploited his perceived innocence to lure victims was undone by the very legal system he sought to manipulate. Ted Bundy's chilling ability to blend seamlessly into everyday life baffled not only law enforcement, but also captivated the media, who scrambled to understand the mind behind such cunning brutality. Early on, the Federal Bureau of Investigation dispatched behavioral analysts to interview Bundy extensively, most notably FBI agent Robert Capel, who conducted the landmark personality assessment interviews at Florida State Prison in 1980. During these sessions, Bundy displayed an uncanny command of psychological terminology, dissecting his own motivations with eerie detachment. He confessed to harboring and acting upon violent impulses against women who fit a specific type, a combination of long, dark hair and understated attire that, in his twisted calculus, represented a rejection in his personal life. This self-awareness of his pattern made him textbook material for an organized offender, meticulous in planning, methodical in execution, and conscious of leaving as little physical evidence as possible. Agents noted how Bundy's education in psychology gave him added tools to manipulate both victims and investigators, allowing him to adapt his methods as law enforcement closed in, switching from feigned injuries to outright force when his signature ruse risked detection. While the FBI's psychological profile circulated within police circles, the broader public learned about Bundy's monstrous duality through sensational news coverage that blurred fact with fascination. Local television stations in Florida aired reconstructed reenactments of the Chi Omega murders, showing Bundy's peerless ability to feign authority, sometimes posing as a police officer to gain trust, an image that both horrified and morbidly intrigued viewers. National magazines ran lurid covers featuring Bundy's stark mug, shot beside headlines like, "Is your neighbor Ted Bundy?" fueling a wave of panic, even in towns untouched by his crimes. Newspapers dissected every detail of his self-representation at trial, his tailored suits, his calm demeanor, his theatrical objections to the prosecution, and reporters struggled to reconcile the polite, articulate man in the courtroom with the savage killer described by survivors and witnesses. This dissonance only intensified public interest. Bundy became the archetype of the wolf in sheep's clothing, the smiling face that hid a predator, and true crime journalists published deep dives into his past, interviewing old girlfriends, college acquaintances, and crisis hotline volunteers who recounted a quietly charismatic figure who answered calls in an earnest-sounding voice, never suspecting they were talking to someone obsessed with violence. In the decades since his execution, Bundy's own voice, captured in recorded interviews, and his handwritten death mask confessions, has become central to academic studies and documentaries alike. Series such as Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes weave together Bundy's calm, conversational tone with archival news clips, peeling back layers of his personality even as he boasts of deceiving those closest to him. Psychologists and criminologists reference his case as the textbook example of a psychopathic predator, noting his superficial charm, lack of genuine empathy, and pathological need for control. Even now, mass media grapples with the ethics of profiling Bundy. Networks sometimes air his interviews unedited, exposing a chillingly articulate killer whose explanations of his own behavior border on clinical fascination. Yet for every analysis that seeks to understand Bundy's psyche, there emerges a counterargument that his calculated manipulations during those interviews make any self-reported insight suspect. After all, he was as skilled at performing for cameras as he was at luring victims. In this way, Bundy not only shaped the evolution of criminal profiling, but also transformed media coverage of serial crime. inspiring an entire genre of true crime storytelling that continues to probe whether the allure of his persona risks overshadowing the memory of the women he murdered. Ted Bundy was officially imprisoned on death row at Florida State Prison in Ryford on July 24, 1979, following his conviction for the Chi Omega murders in Miami. From the moment he arrived, his primary focus shifted from evading capture to exhausting every possible avenue for delay, legal or otherwise. Bundy's self-representation in his trials had already demonstrated his belief that he could manipulate the system. Now, confined to death row, he launched a series of appeals, petitions, and motions that would occupy court dockets for nearly a decade. Within weeks of sentencing, Bundy's first move was to challenge the constitutionality of his self-representation. On August 12, 1979, his attorneys filed a petition arguing he had not been properly advised of the risks in waiving counsel. They claimed Bundy's legal knowledge was insufficient to navigate the complexities of Florida's death penalty statutes, thereby rendering his waiver invalid. The Florida Supreme Court, however, upheld the conviction and sentence on November 15, 1979, finding that Bundy had been made aware of all potential consequences and had insisted on representing himself of his own free will. While awaiting the outcome of that appeal, Bundy began corresponding with attorneys nationwide. He retained Carville Hall, a Clearwater-based lawyer, who filed a motion for a new trial on January 10, 1980, citing newly discovered evidence. A witness who claimed to have seen another man wearing a ski mask near the Chi Omega house on the night of the murders. Bundy insisted that this potential masked intruder had been the real assailant. After a series of depositions and hearings, a state circuit judge denied the motion on March 5, 1980, ruling that the new testimony was too speculative to warrant retrial. Bundy immediately appealed that denial to the Florida Supreme Court, but on May 3, 1980, that court again refused relief, affirming there was no reasonable probability the testimony would have changed the jury's verdict. In the interim, Bundy's defense team also pursued habeas corpus relief in federal courts. On June 17, 1980, a petition was filed in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Florida, arguing that Bundy's Sixth Amendment rights had been violated when he was forced to wear restraints and shackles during his 1979 trial. His lawyers contended that the visible restraints prejudiced jurors against him. The district court took the case under advisement, and Bundy remained out of view of the public until December 3, 1980, when Judge William A. Campbell issued a written opinion denying the habeas petition. Judge Campbell held that the evidence of Bundy's guilt was overwhelming and that any prejudice from restraints would have been minimal compared to the substantial forensic and eyewitness evidence already presented. During these protracted legal battles, Bundy's behavior on death row grew increasingly erratic. Prison guards noted his obsession with maintaining control over his surroundings. He meticulously arranged his cell, kept his few personal belongings, primarily books on law, psychology, and crime scene investigation, in precise order, and insisted on converting his bunk into a death watch library, where he spent hours reading legal commentaries and drafting memos. Bundy also began a series of written confessions, mailing cryptic death mask letters to various law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. In these handwritten pages, dates and pseudonyms coded in an unreadable cipher, he hinted at locations of unconfirmed victims, promising to reveal more information upon receipt of a certain acknowledgement. Detectives in Oregon and Washington scrambled to verify these claims, but most turned out to be vague or unverifiable, and officials eventually classified them as beyond credible proof. By mid-1981, Bundy had shifted strategies. Rather than claiming innocence outright, he offered to identify victims in exchange for a stay of execution. On August 15, 1981, he sent a memorandum to Judge William Harry Jayer, Jr., in Hillsborough County, proposing that, if provided immunity from the death penalty, I will disclose the location of // whose remains lie in Washington state. Prosecutors in Florida adamantly refused, noting that Bundy's confessions had been inconsistent and sometimes demonstrably false. Despite Bundy's repeated entreaties, neither state authorities nor the families of missing women ever granted him the assurances he demanded. Bundy's next major appeal came in November 1982, when he petitioned the Florida Supreme Court for a second time, this time arguing that racial bias in the jury pool had tainted his trial. He cited an African-American juror who had been dismissed during jury selection in Hillsborough County, claiming that the prosecutor's use of a peremptory challenge against that juror violated his rights under Batson v. Kentucky. The Florida Supreme Court declined to hear new arguments on racial bias on January 25, 1983, ruling that Bundy had failed to establish a prima facie case under Batson. Around that same time, Bundy's lawyers sought to introduce expert psychological testimony on his behalf, hoping a psychologist could cast doubt on Bundy's competency to stand trial and waive counsel in his earlier proceedings. On February 10, 1983, a court-appointed psychiatrist evaluated Bundy and concluded he was competent and utterly aware of the legal strategies required for his appeals. With that, Bundy's challenge on grounds of competency was effectively ended. The mid-1980s saw Bundy's legal options dwindle, but he persisted. In March 1984, he filed a Rule 3.850 motion, state post-conviction relief, claiming that Florida prison officials had mishandled evidence from his automobile, specifically that blood-stained carpet fibers had been contaminated. A Pinellas County Circuit judge held an evidentiary hearing on May 22, 1984, where crime lab experts testified that the original kit in which the Volkswagen's carpet fragments were stored had been properly sealed and logged. The judge denied the motion on June 14, 1984, finding no credible proof of contamination. Bundy's subsequent appeal to the Florida Supreme Court was denied on September 4, 1984. With state remedies exhausted, Bundy moved to the federal courts one last time. On November 12, 1984, he filed a second federal habeas corpus petition, this time asserting that growth in DNA testing technology would exonerate him if applied to the blood evidence from the Chi Omega car. Although DNA profiling existed, the technology was still nascent and required substantial intact samples, conditions the degraded evidence could not satisfy. The U.S. District Court dismissed the petition for lack of merit on February 28, 1985. Bundy's final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, seeking certiorari on April 3, 1985, was denied without comment on June 24, 1985. By mid-1985, with all formal appeals denied, Bundy's focus shifted back to confessions. In a July 14, 1985, letter to the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington, he claimed responsibility for the 1971 disappearance of Linda Ann Healy, another woman fitting his typical victim profile. Detectives exhumed a small remote site near Issaquah, Washington, but found only animal remains and non-human bone fragments. Over the next 2 years, Bundy's offers to reveal victim locations continued to pour in. He corresponded with law enforcement in Oregon, Idaho, and even Mexico, offering tantalizing details but no definitive proof. Investigators grew increasingly skeptical, attributing much of his correspondence to attempts at psychological manipulation. Bundy reveled in the notoriety and refused to grant closure to grieving families unless he could control the terms. In late 1987, Bundy made his last major legal plea by requesting a new sentencing hearing on the grounds that he had been inadequately represented during his original appeals. He argued that new counsel had failed to raise critical Sixth Amendment issues, particularly regarding jury instructions on mitigating factors. A Leon County Circuit judge convened a status conference on January 12, 1988, ultimately dismissing the motion on February 3, 1988, after finding no constitutional violation in Bundy's prior representation. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed this decision on April 8, 1988. With all legal avenues exhausted, Bundy's execution was scheduled for January 24, 1989. In the months leading up to that date, his communications with the outside world dwindled. He granted a final interview to reporter Hugh Inesworth on December 15, 1988, in which he remained evasive about specifics, again promising more revelations he never delivered. In his last letters, written in pristine cursive, Bundy expressed remorse of a peculiar kind, admitting he had failed to protect society, but stopping short of offering a true apology to his victims. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Bundy was declared competent for execution. Shortly before 7:00 a.m., he was strapped into Florida's electric chair. His final words, recorded by witnesses, were brief. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." At 7:16 a.m., the current flowed. The medical examiner pronounced him dead at 7:23 a.m. Bundy's imprisonment and final appeals underscore a decades-long struggle between a manipulative mind exploiting legal technicalities and a judicial system striving, slowly but inexorably, to uphold justice. Even as his body was laid to rest, and his execution date passed into history, Bundy's maneuvers on death row and his last-minute confessions ensured that his name continued to haunt law enforcement officers, legal scholars, and families of victims for years to come. Ted Bundy's case fundamentally reshaped the way law enforcement and the public understand violent crime, and its legacy reverberates through both criminal justice practices and popular culture. In law enforcement circles, Bundy's exploits highlighted the critical importance of interjurisdictional cooperation. Before Bundy's spree, police departments often guarded information within their own counties or states, hamstringing investigations that spanned multiple regions. Bundy's ability to slip from Washington to Utah, then Colorado and California, exposed the catastrophic cost of siloed information. As a direct result, agencies began establishing more robust channels for sharing composite sketches, forensic findings, and suspect profiles. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which had already begun experimenting with criminal profiling techniques, used Bundy's case as a textbook example of an organized offender, someone who plans meticulously, selects victims based on specific traits, and employs social charm to facilitate abduction. Bundy's apparent mastery of psychological manipulation prompted federal and state agencies to invest heavily in behavioral analysis training, helping future investigators recognize patterns sooner and anticipate a killer's next move. In academia, Bundy became the subject of intense scrutiny by psychologists, criminologists, and sociologists seeking to understand the underpinnings of psychopathy and sexual violence. His willingness to discuss, and sometimes boast about, his crimes in recorded interviews provided a rare window into the mind of a serial killer. Researchers pored over transcripts of Bundy's conversations with FBI profiler Robert Capel, noting his clinical detachment, his description of victims as interchangeable objects, and his frank admission of deriving gratification from power and control. Bundy's insistence that he targeted women who resembled an early romantic interest suggested a warped form of displaced aggression, a theory that influenced subsequent studies on the role of childhood trauma and attachment disorders in the development of violent behavior. Textbooks on criminal psychology often dedicate entire chapters to Bundy, not merely as a notorious historical figure, but as a pivotal case in understanding how an ostensibly well-adjusted, educated individual can harbor a capacity for extreme violence. Meanwhile, Bundy's story captured the public imagination and glided into the mainstream of true crime media. In the 1980s and 1990s, television programs featured Bundy prominently. Documentaries recreated key events, and news magazines aired excerpts from his Florida prison interviews. These broadcasts humanized him in a way that both fascinated and horrified viewers. One moment they saw a polite, articulate young man denying guilt. The next, a man flip-flopping between claiming innocence and offering cryptic confessions. The tension between Bundy's polished exterior and his horrific actions drove ratings, and producers realized that Bundy exemplified a new subgenre of crime storytelling, one focused not solely on the crimes themselves, but on the enigma of the killer. Podcasts and streaming series in recent years have continued this trend, with creators sifting through court transcripts, revisiting crime scenes, and interviewing surviving friends and witnesses to unravel Bundy's complexities. Though some critics argue that repeated retellings risk glamorizing Bundy's persona, true crime enthusiasts counter that each new iteration serves as a cautionary tale and a reminder of the importance of vigilance. Outside of official investigations and media portrayals, Bundy's case also influenced broader cultural conversations about violence against women and personal safety. College campuses began instituting mandatory counseling and safety workshops in the late 1970s, teaching students to be wary of strangers and to travel in groups at night, protocols that persist today. Workshops on self-defense and bystander intervention often cite Bundy's ruses as examples of how predators can exploit goodwill. He simultaneously undermined assumptions that charity and politeness were safe. Beyond academic settings, Bundy's name became shorthand for a charismatic predator lurking beneath a veneer of normalcy, shaping the public's understanding of psychopathic behavior. Legal scholars and ethicists likewise continue debating the implications of granting media access to criminals like Bundy. While first-hand interviews can illuminate the workings of a criminal mind, they also provide a platform for individuals who thrive on notoriety. Decades after his death, Bundy's imprint remains controversial, yet undeniable. Cold case investigators still examine his cryptic death mask letters, hoping advanced DNA and forensic techniques might at last confirm whether he was responsible for unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. True crime writers still vie to uncover new details, interviewing peripheral figures like former girlfriends, college professors, and crisis hotline volunteers who recall Bundy's early charisma. His life has inspired multiple films, novels, and theatrical productions, each attempting to strike a balance between demystifying a monster and avoiding sensationalism. In law enforcement training programs, Bundy's case is taught as a pivotal lesson. Criminals who appear ordinary may harbor an extraordinary capacity for evil, and only through vigilant data sharing, rigorous profiling, and community awareness can such predators be stopped. Ultimately, Ted Bundy's legacy lies not only in the horror of his crimes, but in the systemic reforms, academic inquiries, and cultural dialogues they instigated, ensuring that the lessons learned from his reign of terror continue to inform and protect future generations. In the end, Ted Bundy's story serves as a stark reminder of how easily our expectations of normalcy can be manipulated by appearance and charm. His crimes teach us that evil does not always wear a menacing face. Sometimes it hides in a friendly smile or a polite request. We see how crucial it is for communities, colleges, and law enforcement to remain vigilant, share information, and trust instincts when something feels off, even if it goes against our natural tendency to give others the benefit of the doubt. Bundy's reign of terror exposed gaps in interjurisdictional cooperation, underscoring the importance of real-time communication between agencies. It also demonstrated how advances in forensic science and criminal profiling, driven in part by the lessons learned from his case, can turn the tide against predators who rely on anonymity and deceit. Finally, Bundy reminds us that behind every high-profile criminal is an incalculable number of survivors and victims' families whose lives were forever altered. Honoring their memories means continuing to improve our systems of prevention, investigation, and support for those affected by violence. If there is one takeaway, it's that vigilance, compassion, and collaboration are our best defenses against those who would exploit trust and kindness for malevolent ends.